Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And I have a question for you, listener, which is, how do you best make sense of the world? Do you go big picture or do you go little picture? And let me pose that question metaphorically by saying, if I were to ask you to make sense of what is happening, say, outside your window right now in your backyard, if you have a backyard, what gives you a better picture of what's happening in that part of the world? Let's say I could give you big picture data on the weather trends. Even for that day, you can track the change of the temperature by the hour or the changing wind patterns, or you can get the soil composition levels and all of its different elements and the moisture levels and so forth. Or you could go outside and you can look at one flower growing in your backyard and smell the scent, feel the petals, see which way the stem is angling in relation to the wind and the sun. Which gets you at life's truth and the truth about this world. Now, I think the real answer is that you need both, but I have to say that temperamentally, I'm a big picture guy. I probably read 20 nonfiction and social science books for every novel that I may happen to finally read. I'm drawn to big paradigms in theology and culture, but lately, I've been learning to value more the little picture, to actually that gives us a window into the world that has its own kind of truth. For listeners who have been following along Good Faith, this is a big reason why I've been just listening to more music lately, is that one piece of music can open up some realities, especially emotional realities of the world of life, that all of the big social science books may miss in some way. And that informs how I'm approaching today's conversation, because the topic that I wanted to address is a big picture topic. It's a big picture topic about how Western culture is changing and evolving in how it views life itself, which is a really big question. And by that, I mean, how are us as a culture, as a society, how do we welcome new life? And you can look at big picture data on this that show across Western societies, we have dramatically falling birth rates that show, for all of its complexity, that at a fundamental level, we are welcoming new life less and less. Or how do we expect to engineer life in a way that's more free from seeming problems and challenges? And you see this in the rise of genetic testing, genetic engineering, genetic medicine. We are increasingly thinking we should be able to change life itself, to modify it to be free of challenges that we might face. And then finally, how do we value or don't value life when it is especially challenging? And you think about this in terms of our dramatically rising rates in suicide, in euthanasia, and abortion rates. Those are all reflections about how do we treat life when it's especially hard. So all these big picture questions: how do we welcome new life? How do we engineer life? How do we value life when it's especially hard? These are like big picture questions. I thought, how do we get at all these big pictures? And then I thought, maybe there's a small picture way to get at that. Maybe there's a way that we can smell a flower, look at a flower, feel a flower on these big picture questions. And that's when I thought of my guest for today, Amy Julia Becker, who has given me permission to call her AJ. So Amy Julia Becker, AJ Becker, she helps people reimagine life through her writing and her speaking on disability, faith, and culture. She's the author of numerous books on this topic and other topics as well, including To Be Made Well, White Picket Fences, Small Talk, and A Good and Perfect Gift. She's written for national publication and hosts the Reimagining the Good Life podcast, which I've had the privilege to be on. She graduated from Princeton University and Princeton Theological Seminary with an MDiv. She lives with her husband and their 3 children in Western Connecticut. And one of those 3 children is Penny, an 18-year-old with Down syndrome. And it's Penny and AJ's relationship with Penny that is really the small flower that I want us to take a look at today. And so, Amy Julia Becker, AJ, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here. I am a personal big fan of the Good Faith Podcast. So it's very exciting to be in this seat. Thank you.
I love it when listeners come on the podcast. That just makes me feel like our community is knitting together. So it's a pleasure to have you. Well, let's get into this topic. And it's clear from my intro that at one level, I want to get to know Penny as, in some ways, as a means to look at bigger questions. But Penny is a individual of inestimable value and worth in God's eyes, not just as a means to another ends, but as ends to herself. So please, if you will, introduce Penny, the person, the human being, to our listeners.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. Penny is 18 years old now, so I have lots of stories and lots of years of experience with her as her very own self. And I do think that is just one part of our story that, to your point, really does matter to actually know individuals as such and not just as part of a collective whole, even though the collective matters. So Penny was diagnosed with Down syndrome a couple of hours after she was born. And I think in the beginning, that to us almost seemed to take away her particularity because
Mm.
she went into this category that seemed instinctively seemed different and scary. And thankfully, one of the things that happened really early on, she did not have any major health concerns. And so anytime she was in the room with us, we felt that fear and grief and angst really dissipate because the presence of this tiny human being who had her dad's black hair, not anymore, but she did as a baby, and my big cheeks and, these big blue eyes and just the need to be held by her parents. That's all we had. And it was a beautiful
Mm.
thing. We just had our baby girl. When she was out of the room, she became this kind of abstract, scary
Mm.
concept called Down syndrome, which actually does not feel so abstract and scary anymore now that we not only know her, but know lots of people with Down syndrome. So Penny now is a senior in high school. As we speak, she is about to graduate from high school. She is a cheerleader. She is a dancer. She actually has recently started saying she'd like to be a writer. She's a good writer. She's a good
Wow.
communicator. Yeah, she's always loved reading. Um, she struggles with math and science, kind of any big abstract concepts are challenging for her. She is very willing in both, sometimes, in both good and bad ways to live in the present moment. She's a big sister to two younger siblings, which is an interesting part of our story as well. There's so much more I could say, but that gives you a little bit of a sketch of who she is.
So I love this tension that you're describing between viewing someone with a condition like Down syndrome as an individual with all of their particularities, and then them getting abstracted into a category. So help us think through that, because everything you've described to her about her and her particularity, I think for our average listener who may not understand Down syndrome or have direct experience would think, she seems like, and I'm going to use ear quotes around this word, she seems like a normal, again, air quotes around that,
Yep.
around the kid. And so help them understand, well, so how does this condition, which is now has an abstract label, how does it actually intersect with the particularities of her individual life?
Yeah, it's such a good point. And I think one thing to know about Down syndrome, and this is certainly true of many genetic conditions, is that there is the way, in her case, everyone with Down syndrome has an extra copy or a third copy of the 21st chromosome. Usually we have pairs of chromosomes. Sometimes they get stuck together in conception. And in her case, she got 3 copies of the 21st chromosome. The way that expresses itself genetically in every body with Down syndrome is going to be different. There's kind of sets of things that can happen, whether that is holes in the heart or small stature, or actually there's some distinctive qualities to people with Down syndrome, their eyes, not only the shape of the eye, which often people notice, but actually the pupil and the iris is quite beautiful. So there are all of these different things that come from having that extra copy. In Penny's case, she did have some holes in her heart when she was born. Some of them closed up on their own. One needed to be repaired when she was 14 months old with a minor but significant procedure. She has tiny ears. So we see an audiologist and an otolaryngologist, annually. She had tubes put in her ears 7 times, I think. Just, so again, not a huge deal. She had scoliosis, which I think it's something like 1% of all girls have scoliosis, 3% of girls with Down syndrome. So on the one hand, it's not very many people with Down syndrome who have scoliosis. On the other hand, it's 3 times what the typical girl, the chances are 3 times as high. And that's true with things like celiac disease and leukemia and various other health conditions that Penny has not had. There's a higher likelihood, even though it's not something we've experienced. But scoliosis was a big deal for her. She had to wear a brace for 4 years, 20 hours a day. It was a pain. Thankfully, that is long behind us because she has reached her full height, which is 4'6". So again, you can kind of hear in this that a lot of her particularities probably are related to Down syndrome. She wears glasses. And again, that cognitive ability that she has is, abstract concepts are hard. Some aspects of memory can be hard. Understanding nuance in social interactions or inferences, sarcasm, she works really hard to understand those things. And yet she's also very capable in ways that I don't think I had ever understood could be compatible with an intellectual disability, earlier in her life, where she really is, as I said, she's a good writer. She just did a 30-minute presentation in front of 50 people and she did it with excellence, so it's a little bit, it's almost like that's part of why it's so good to be able to speak specifically about her and yet to also know the next person you meet with Down syndrome will have a whole different story for many of these things.
Okay. So I want to move this conversation now into this bigger question of how we as a society welcome new life. So it sounds like you did not know that Penny had Down syndrome during pregnancy. So you discovered this at birth, right?
Yes, that's true. The prenatal testing landscape has changed significantly since I was pregnant because she's now 18. So, it was 18 and almost 19 years ago when I was given the option of a blood test and it was told, this is non-invasive. It will pose no harm to you or your fetus. And so I said, sure, I'll take a blood test and see what that information. And, you really, at least I did as a young mom who had not done any thinking about these things. I thought, oh, good, I can check the box and know that there are a few things I don't need to worry about. So that blood test resulted in a statistic that said I had a 1 in 250 chance of having a baby with Down syndrome. Because I was young, I was 28, I should have had a 1 in 1,000 chance of having a baby with Down syndrome. And so my doctor advised me on that and said, do you want to do more testing? I did not want an amnio because there's a risk of miscarriage. And that would have been a definitive test. So we opted for a level 2 ultrasound, which, the technician should not have said this, but during that ultrasound, the technician said, this baby does not have Down syndrome because there were a number of markers that a technician would be looking for that Penny didn't have. And so we thought that meant that we definitively did not have a baby, kind of the one thing we know is we don't have a baby with Down syndrome. At the same time, we had made some choices along the way with that testing because we knew that we would welcome whatever life we were given. And so we declined an amnio because we didn't see any need to have the option of abortion on our table. That was just not something we wanted. So even that story, I tell it at length because I think it's relevant to the decisions that women are making now when it comes to testing in terms of what information do you want and why do you want it? And I think it's really important not only for women and families to be thinking that through, but for doctors to understand that some women want choices and other women are like, yeah, no, that's actually not a choice I want to even be presented with. Because right now, many women do testify to having been given a prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome with a fair amount of bias and pressure towards termination that is just traumatic, honestly, for them to be told by an authority figure like a doctor, either implicitly or explicitly, that they should not be carrying the baby that they have. So there's a lot we can talk about here, but
let's talk about that because because this gets into, I think, how Down syndrome, again, I think is a a window into this way in which our society, and in particular our medical culture, shapes us in how we welcome life. So can you unpack that a little more? Like, what has changed in terms of the testing options, not just for Down syndrome, but for a whole host of conditions now, that is both available and perhaps even in ways that are not, in which the woman and the husband or the father may not be even aware that they are being shaped and influenced in certain ways through the process, and can just easily be carried along this cultural stream that Western medicine is on. So yeah, unpack that for us a little more.
Yeah, and there's so much to say. So just interrupt me if I go on for too long. But the way the testing has changed is that it's become more less invasive in the sense that it carries less. It's interesting. I was talking to an anthropologist who has a child with Down syndrome the other day named Tom Pearson, and he writes in his book that the testing has become less risky for the fetus unless the fetus has Down syndrome.
Right.
Like that, there's actually,
Right.
because if you look at the statistics, it's
Yes.
like there is. And so I appreciated him kind of putting that clarification on there. What now can happen is that earlier and earlier in pregnancy, researchers have discovered they can take a blood sample from the mother, and there are usually fetal DNA cells that are circulating within the mother's blood. So if
Yeah.
I, as a mom, do not have Down syndrome, but you find evidence of Down syndrome in my blood, which is to say that third copy of the 21st chromosome, then that provides a really, in the case of Down syndrome, these tests are fairly accurate. They're still not a diagnosis. They're still a screening test, but nevertheless, a real high indication that I am going to be giving birth to a child with Down syndrome. And that the reason that now can happen in the first trimester, which was not true when I was pregnant with Penny. And what that means is that you have, in some ways, a rush towards termination, simply because both doctors and patients would rather choose termination earlier in pregnancy. There are a variety of problems with that also, in the sense that you are under some time pressure. And as a new mom who's learning information about your child that A, may or may not be accurate, probably is accurate, but B, I mean, I didn't want to talk to anyone else who had a baby with Down syndrome for months until after Penny was born, because I had been shaped by a culture that felt like a culture of rejection and exclusion and misinformation about her. And so I can't imagine being in the situation of, if I had wanted a choice, making that choice within the course of a couple of days. But two, you may or may not be carrying a baby with Down syndrome. And especially with some of the other conditions that can be determined or indicated through these tests, it's really advised to get a secondary follow-up diagnostic test, which would happen later in pregnancy. So there just are a lot of different practical issues, fears. And then the last thing I'll say here is there was a study that came out last fall, and it demonstrated bias in diagnosis by doctors. So when doctors, 60% of doctors were seen to be biased in how they presented an indication or diagnosis of Down syndrome, which again, that's not what's supposed to happen. There's supposed to be a neutral, hey, we've learned this information. What do you want to do with it? And yet the bias itself does, obviously shape and form, as you were saying, women's perceptions. You've got a scary situation and an authority figure telling you implicitly or explicitly what you should do about it. It's hard to go against that.
Yeah. Well, and what is this doing for the actual demographics of sort of prevalence of individuals with Down syndrome? Because before I did the research, I thought, we're just having less and less individuals, and this may go away because of this, and go away, not necessarily, I think, for good reasons, but go away because of just this medical impulse to do more testing, find out genetic flaws, and then, pressure, influence, or at least offer in a very strong way the option of abortion. So what's actually happening in terms of the numbers?
So, in America, in the United States, the numbers are staying relatively stable, even though the incidence of termination is increasing. And the reason is because more women are having babies later in life. And the only thing we know that increases the chance of having a baby with Down syndrome is getting older as a mom. And so it's really interesting because there are more older women having babies in general, and therefore there are more babies conceived who have Down syndrome. And even though we're doing more testing and more termination, what it also shows us is actually lots of women are either opting out of the testing or they're getting the testing and they're saying, okay, great, that helps me prepare well for the baby who I'm about to welcome. So I do think it's important. One thing that happens especially in pro-life circles, is a number gets thrown around that 90% of babies with Down syndrome are aborted. And that's actually categorically untrue. That people aren't trying to lie. That comes from this information back actually maybe 20 or more years ago, when 90% of women who had a prenatal diagnosis, which means they had an amniocentesis, who received the diagnosis of Down syndrome, chose to abort. And that was true. But now you have women who are not having an amnio. They're getting a diagnosis or an indication early on in their pregnancies and making different choices. Again, many people are choosing. We think right now that the number of women with a prenatal diagnosis is closer to maybe 30 or 40%. So it's still high, and still something I think that's really worth talking about in terms of which lives do we value and how do we welcome people and all of those questions.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I really want women to know that it is not the norm to decide not to have a baby with Down syndrome. And there are countries in Europe where there are no babies with Down syndrome being born. Iceland is essentially one of them. Denmark, this is now a long time ago, but had they don't have this on their website anymore, but they had a page on their website saying that the goal was, through prenatal testing, to have no babies born with Down syndrome. So again, that has happened elsewhere, but that's not what's happening here, even though I think it's pretty important for us to be having this conversation so that women are informed, not only about the testing, but also about what does life with Down syndrome look like, and how can we explore and imagine a good life that is not only for people with 46 chromosomes.
Yeah, I mean, I think of somebody who's a cheerleader, who's a writer, budding writer, like that is even if she wasn't that would be a life worth celebrating. But the fact that she is that, how could you say this is a life we should eradicate? And so I think I want to ask a pointed question to you, AJ, which is, when you look at that website from Iceland or from these other European countries that have declared our goal is to eradicate, I mean, just I'll say this bluntly, people like your daughter. Yeah. What does that do to you? How do you process that? I mean, I'm just trying to think for myself, like, okay, let's just say you mentioned scoliosis as one of the markers of Down syndrome. I have scoliosis. I grew up with scoliosis. I wore a brace when I was a kid. What if that was actually and that could have been just decided through the sort of cultural trends that, like, no, scoliosis, we want to eradicate scoliosis. Like, well, I wouldn't be around.
Yeah. It's interesting. I have grown a pretty thick skin on this topic because to go there emotionally is pretty hard. I do think it is, at the same time, I read this book recently called An Ordinary Future by Tom Pearson, who I just mentioned before. And he is like a progressive anthropologist professor, but did a deep dive into some of these questions around eugenics and abortion and Down syndrome, going back to the fact that, like, literally the Nazi regime went after people with disabilities and intellectual disabilities before almost anyone else. So has just been this Western ideal that people with Down syndrome do not live up to for a long time. And even actually, this was as recently as 1968, where The Atlantic published an essay by a father of a child with Down syndrome who had died, and the father was advocating for euthanasia for children with Down syndrome. And a medical ethicist who is also an Episcopal priest wrote back in defense of the euthanasia. Like, so it's just like, this is relatively recent in our even American consciousness. And yet I think, and so for me, it actually feels like a tragedy. Yes, I can get angry. Yes, it's an injustice. But what has happened in my life more than anything else Yes, Penny belongs here. She is valuable. She is a contributor. Her life matters. But oh my gosh, the rest of us desperately need her. Like, it's not just that we should be benevolent and allow her to take up space in this world. It is that me, as like an overachieving, Princeton educated Westerner who, got straight A's or whatever, I desperately need not just Penny, but people like Penny who will expand my imagination about what it means to be human and be beloved. I desperately need her. And I interact with people all the time who are more like me. And so I think there is a tragedy in any nation, family, community that says we don't want people like you, and we don't see our real need for that.
I think that's profound, because if we say, let's just pick out of the various markers with somebody with Down syndrome, it's the IQ is the thing that we really feel like, is the problematic thing here. What does that do for those of us who are accepting the decision, supporting it, or just tacitly agreeing with it, or what does that do for us if we start thinking, no, really, actually, IQ levels, your intellectual capacity, is actually a marker of your value as a human being, whether you ought to live or die? What happens then for us when our own human acuity, our own intellect starts declining, which it will in old age, right, if nothing else, or we get into an accident, or we have suffer from brain damage, or there's any number of ways in which our lives, our human intellects are fluid, changing, and actually fated to decline, like with 100% certainty. Like, we will all die, we will all lose our mental capacity. So what does that mean for us if we're going to accept a vision of life in which the marker of a value of a life is pegged to your IQ level? That's a self-sentence of deep insecurity and self-doubt for ourselves, because then we have to constantly measure, am I still as sharp as I used to be? Because my value as a human being depends on this, right?
That, like, one of the parables that I've returned to over and over recently in the past couple of years is in Luke 14, when Jesus gives the picture of the wedding banquet. And what's so fascinating is it starts out where he's actually at dinner in the home of like a prominent religious person who we can imagine, was wealthy and also moral and intelligent and all of those things, right? And he says to him, you shouldn't have invited the people who are here. And when you give a dinner party, you shouldn't invite your friends and your neighbors, because they can repay you. But instead, you should invite the lame, the poor, the crippled. I can't remember what politically incorrect words Jesus uses there, but he does. And then he says, and you will be blessed. He doesn't say invite them because then justice will be served, or invite them because then you'll demonstrate to God that you are a good person. He says invite them and you will be blessed. So that sense of that transactional nature of being able to invite your friends over because then they can repay you by having you back, where you're setting up relationships based on tit for tat, like earning and buying and selling and keeping my social position, rather than a spirit of like, we are interconnected and it's going to be a blessing to be together as humans. It's a really different way of being. And I really believe that is something you were just speaking to, that it's not only that, yes, all of us are in danger if IQ is the measure of our value in the world, because it will change, but it's also that the way of being in the world that says I'm only valuable when I can think in a certain way, when I can prove myself in a certain way, when I am independently able, that way of being in the world is really ultimately self-destructive, dehumanizing, destroys community. Like, there's so much deterioration that actually comes from that. Whereas a way of being that's based upon like the blessing of God, the belovedness of knowing one another and being in relationship that is not transactional, but is rather mutual and interdependent, it's a really different way to be.
I want to take one more turn on this, because I love this idea of someone like Penny, and Penny herself, being a blessing to the world by her very life and being. And in a way, in this whole topic of Down syndrome as a window of how we welcome life, it can be tempting to actually reduce someone like Penny to be a mere object of that conversation, where it's like we are trying to welcome Penny. And that's good. That's important for us to expand our imagination of who we welcome at the table,
Mm-hmm.
such that it encompasses Penny. And we are blessed if we have that expanded imagination of a welcome of life. But it also strikes me from my limited experience with people with Down syndrome is that they actually teach us and show us how to welcome life ourselves, that we're actually the objects in this whole equation, if you will, that we are
Mm-hmm.
being taught and blessed by their posture towards life. So that's been my sort of experience. But I, you as a mother, can you expand on that more? And like, how does somebody with Down syndrome, Penny in particular, how has she taught you how to welcome life?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I can kind of get at it in two different ways. One is that she is just a kind and encouraging person who often remembers or notices human need when I am inclined to rush past or forget.
Mm.
Um, so there is actually, she literally welcomes people. Not always, but sometimes she's like in her own world watching a show and doesn't notice that you walk in the room. So I don't mean to paint her as some sort of angel, but at the same time, if she hears that someone has been ill or in need in some way, she is going to remember that and go out of her way, whether that's writing a note or coming alongside them if it's someone in her family. But I also think, again, and back into the way of being in the world, one of the things she did last summer, she was at a camp that the state of Connecticut actually invited her to for kids with intellectual disabilities. And she came back with a list of kind of goals for my future. And one of the things she wrote down was not rushing. And it was so striking to me because Penny lives in a family that certainly feels to her like a family that rushes all the time. And she never, she does not complain. She does not get exasperated with that. But I just felt so convicted by those words, not rushing, that this is a value that she has, and it's a good value. It really is. And so sometimes it means Penny, if you don't want to rush in the morning, you have to get out of bed earlier than you want to, because I can keep you on a really tight schedule to get out the door on time and you'll get more sleep, or you have to decide that I want it to take longer. But there are other times where that's really, again, she's teaching me how to welcome a different way of being in the world that's not so efficient and productive and, rushing through things all the time and getting all the things done. And there are lots of things like that where there's maybe a more humble posture, a more vulnerable posture, and a less Penny also, and I think this is true for a lot of people with Down syndrome that I've known, does not feel a need to prove herself. It is, I've written about her before as having esteem, she has esteem for herself without ego, without a sense. Oh gosh, it was in, recently I was reading in Galatians right after Paul writes about the fruit of the Spirit. He says, and it's kind of funny because love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, keeping in step with the Spirit. It's beautiful. And then he says, do not be conceited, envying one another, and competing with one another.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought, that. I've never seen Penny be, that's actually something it is hard for her to understand, envy. Right. She doesn't compete with other people. She'll try to win if we're playing a game together, and she will totally just shrug it off if she loses. It's not like she's not trying to win, but she also is you won. Okay, moving on. It's a different way.
That's so profound. I mean, think about if you were to offer people, hey, here's a genetic condition that will teach you you will be living a life that is not rushed, not enslaved to proving yourself, not enslaved to envy. Would you want that life? I think most people are, what's the drug I need to take? What's the genetic modification that I need to take for that life? How hungry we are as Westerners, for a life that's not rushed, not proving oneself, and not envious. And yet we flipped it completely around and said, no, that's the condition we're actually trying to eradicate. That's a parable for us to sit with and ponder for a bit. We've been talking about welcoming life. AJ, I want to talk about how we have this drive as Westerners, modern Western scientific individuals, to engineer life, to actually construct and create a life that it gets where the problems get engineered out of our existence, and we can optimize our life for greater efficiency and productivity and so forth. How has your experience as a parent challenged this engineering impulse we have to engineer life in this way?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple ways. One was going back to those early days with Penny when I was aware that my both kind of cultural and theological grids had this instinct to put her in a different category of human in which she was more broken than I was. So I really did like, again, instinctively, I had a sense of like, whoa, where's this coming from? But I did have this instinct to say, I've thought about the world in terms of kind of the fallenness of creation. And I thought, well, it seems like her body is more broken than mine. And I'm not saying she has any fault in that, but that seems like kind of a fault within creation. And then similarly, if you go into kind of a more secular space, that sense of birth defect or abnormality or, disorder, all of these different words imply there's something different that is wrong about her, and written into her genetic code. So I was really challenged by that. And as I pondered it, I thought, I do think there are ways in which our bodies and our minds are broken, whether that's theologically or just genetically speaking. I think that's true. And yet, I think what I was doing was I was putting brokenness and limitation into the same box. And when I started to, and a friend pointed this out to me, but when I started to pull those apart, I started to say, wait a second, am I really responding to Penny's brokenness or to her limitations? And are those limitations and vulnerabilities just more pronounced than mine? Of course they are as an infant, but even as an adult, is that going to be true for her? That it is more obvious, it is written on her face that she has a different body and brain than a typical kid. And yet, is there actually something that is either causing suffering or separation from herself, from God, from others that is as a result of this? Because that's really my understanding of sin, is that which separates us from the love of God, the love of one another, the love of our creation, it separates us from love. And I did not actually see any signs of that brokenness in this baby girl or the toddler girl or the young woman who she is now. And so understanding limitations really helped me to begin to understand life differently. And that was true not only in terms of receiving Penny, but honestly, in terms of receiving myself as a limited human, as a human who needs other people.
Let me jump in here, AJ, because what your story is making me think of an interaction I had with a friend, somebody who I was just getting to know, becoming friends with. And so I was learning more about his life. And he, over dinner, was then sharing with me about a child that has autism in his family that I didn't know about. I was finding out about this for the first time. So I was showing interest in asking more. Well, what's that like? And he was describing it. And then what he was describing provoked in me this reaction that I suspect you've had before, and I think you've mentioned before, is what sometimes what doctors even give to mothers or families when they're discovered that they might have a infant with Down syndrome, which is, I said these two words. I said, "I'm sorry." Maybe I said three words. I think, oh, I'm sorry, I think is what I said. And his response was interesting and took me off guard, because he said, not meanly or angrily, but with some energy and force, "Don't say sorry." And I was about to say, "Oh, I'm sorry for saying I was sorry," which would have trapped me in an endless recursive loop of apology. So instead of doing that, what I did was I just was quiet, and I was just listening to him more kind of go on with what my initial "I'm sorry" triggered. And I realized as I was listening to him is that he was describing his son and his condition not as a brokenness, but simply as an is, as this, and as an is with all of its limitations. And it suddenly struck me like, oh, it would, what just happened there would have been like if I was describing my youngest daughter who has a learning disability, but as a result has become I think, really gravitating towards careers, which she's very tactile. She's doing urban agriculture. So it would have been if I say,
Cool.
my daughter has a learning disability, but she's really into urban agriculture and she's really into tactile things that she can touch. And then if he had said in response,
I'm
oh,
sorry.
I'm sorry, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, that's what just happened there. So can you unpack that a little bit more for those of us who are interacting with people like you who have done a deep work, as I think this friend has done, to actually reframe, I think, healthily and theologically in a sort of God-centered way, how they view their kids. But we're coming in from the outside and we're bumbling in with words like, oh, I'm sorry.
Yes. Well, so first of all, I mean, most of us bumble when it comes to actually caring for one another. And that is something I felt much more sensitive to early on in Penny's life. And I feel like, thankfully, I've gotten to a place where not only do I recognize how much I bumbled around, before she was born, but even after she was born. But also just that sense of you, again, sitting there and wanting to listen and learn is actually an indication of a potential, at least, for connection and love. So to any listener who's like, oh my gosh, I did that too, if you actually remember doing it, you can go back and be like, I know this is about to start that terrible recursive loop, but I'm sorry I said I was sorry because I understand something differently now. And that always does really mean a lot to me if someone comes back and says, I was thinking about this conversation and I want to do it a little bit differently. That is helpful. But the other thing I will say is, I think it's important. That line for me between limitations and brokenness is a helpful one because there are things that can come, whether it's with Down syndrome or with autism, or quite frankly, with me being me, that cause pain and suffering. And, I'm sorry about that. Like that, those are not good. And I think we can name them as such. A lot of the pain and suffering that people with disability experience has more to do with social attitudes towards disability than with an inherent nature of the condition. So I think that's also important to recognize. Penny is often lonely, and I don't think that's because there's something wrong with her. I think it's because we live in a world where it is hard for kids to know how to be friends with people outside of the social norms. And so, but nevertheless, I would say if somebody said, I'm sorry that Penny had to wear a back brace for 4 years, I would say, yeah, me too. Like, I'm sorry about that particular aspect of her condition. And I wish she hadn't had to go through that. Can God do something good with it? Sure. Like, always, but that doesn't mean that it's inherently a good thing. But I would not say I'm sorry that she has Down syndrome, this kind of general, and more something that seems more intrinsic to who she is. And I don't understand how we understand what it means to be fearfully and wonderfully made. And yet I do return to that and to the idea that we're created in God's image. And even just to, there are other passages that just talk about the diversity of the body of Christ as incredibly important, like so necessary and by design. And that as we begin to understand each other that way, it's an enriching, enlivening, good experience.
Right. And it's a fount of wisdom, I think, for us to draw distinctions, which require wisdom to draw, like the one you're drawing that Penny's taught you to draw, between, say, limitations that are meant to be accepted and even in some ways welcomed, and brokenness that actually we, as God's, sort of image bearers, are also meant to fix. And that takes some real discernment at the individual level. Like, just think about all of our individual traits. Like, okay, I'm an introvert. I get tired at parties. And is that a limitation or is that brokenness? Is that something I should just give myself room to say, like, maybe I should just leave parties earlier? Actually, that's what my wife and I have agreed on, is that I just exit parties earlier.
Yeah.
That's a trivial example, but I'm trying to say that distinction is really important, because if we both of us viewed it as, there's something wrong with me, I'm broken, then it's like, now you're forcing me to be like somebody who I'm fundamentally not, and you're inflicting more simply because of a social convention that's been set up. And that's at the micro level, but I want to, again, use the micro as a window into the macro. That is a distinction, that moral wisdom of distinction, say, between limitation and brokenness, that is not guiding sort of are thinking about large scale things like genetic engineering, for instance. That distinction is
Right.
is incredibly blurred, such that in the world of genetic engineering, it's like, no, if it's a limitation we can engineer out of your genome, by all means, let's go ahead and do so. I'm caricaturing it slightly, I think, but I really think that impulse is in play, and I think you've detected that, even when a doctor, like you said, just immediately categorizes this as, this is a broken condition, I'm sorry, and so therefore is saying I'm sorry, right?
Yep. Yeah, and that is, I think it's interesting. There's so many examples of what you're describing, and they're often, I think, posited in this kind of individual decision or choice, whether that's the decision to terminate. What we are now kind of trying to do in terms of genetic engineering is actually avoid even getting to that position, because, okay, well, what if we did, I was offered, after Penny was born, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So that would mean essentially, even though I didn't need this in order to conceive, using in vitro fertilization to conceive an embryo outside of the womb and then decide. So pre-implantation, we
Right.
can diagnose this
Wow.
or not. And we said, no, thank you. Like, we would welcome another baby with Down syndrome if that's who we were given. But I think that's an example. And all of those things. So the first thing I'll say is we are doing a lot of those types of things, and we have an ideal. I guess two other things I'll say. When Penny was born, there was a little baby girl born in the room next door a couple hours later, as it happened, from a seminary classmate of mine. We were in class together, and she had a baby girl. And when her baby girl was born, for some reason, someone in that room just yelled, "She's perfect, she's perfect." And so it felt like this kind of immediate contrast between my daughter and her daughter. And we never talked about this, but I later on really learned that there are two different definitions of perfection. And the one that I have operated with for most of my life is conforming absolutely to an ideal state. So, you have a car that's a perfect car. It never breaks down. You have, it's an ideal. But perfection, and certainly perfection in the New Testament, is actually means being who you are created to be, becoming the end to which you were designed, right? Like, it's fulfilling a purpose.
That's what glory is, another word for that, right?
Yeah, it's a really, really different understanding of what it means for us to be human. And I think it allows for a tremendous amount of diversity. And instead of the perfection that we are pursuing in terms of our genetic engineering, even in terms of, for women my age, we're talking a lot about Botox, and getting our hair dyed and, these kind of minor things. And I'm not trying to say that you're bad if you do those things. I'm just saying that those are, again, these examples of like trying to conform to a norm of perfection or being an ideal, rather than saying, what if we have each been given lives, bodies, minds, spirits that we get to kind of discover and live into? What if, as parents, rather than genetically engineering our children, we are invited to nurture them into who they've been created to be? And it certainly helps to have an understanding of a God who loves us and creates us in order to want to pursue that. And honestly, as a parent who does believe we have a God who creates and loves each of us, I still find myself wanting to at least micromanage, if not genetically engineer my children. So it's tricky in our society. And that's the last thing I'll say, is just that we think of these as individual choices, but there's like a collective consciousness that is really, really powerful. And we even see that when you look at the prenatal testing and where people are choosing to abort babies with Down syndrome, you see that it's really different in different populations. So it's not just like, in America, here's what we do. It's like, no, in the Northeast, here's what we do. And in Utah, it's really different. And in different demographic populations, and there are all sorts of reasons for that. But I think it speaks to the fact that there is a collective either sense of like support and welcome, or exclusion and rejection, because and it's ironic, Connecticut has great social services for people like Penny, and yet many, many women are choosing not to bring people like Penny into the state of Connecticut at birth.
And we have been talking about steering this conversation towards what does somebody with we describe with somebody with disability, what do they present to the collective? And you talked a little bit about what it presents to collective states, for example, and it's different. But I want to talk about the collective that is really important to me and to many of our listeners and to you, which is the church. Like, what does somebody like Penny present to the church? And I want to actually jump to the big picture question and why I think this is an important route to follow down, is because we are seeing a dramatic rise in what we would call deaths of despair. And I would put that, certainly suicide is an example of that, but I would put euthanasia in that category, and I would put abortion in that category. These are where we have despaired about the possibility, the goodness of life, either coming into being or continuing. And that, just to take the example of suicide, right? There are many drivers, broadly, demographically, socially, that we could sort of try to search for why are we seeing ever increasing rises of the death of despair, of suicide. But at the micro individual level, it strikes me that's a life who utterly found themselves alone in the end, either actually socially alone or psychically, spiritually alone, such that they were driven to that. And so it seems to me that, what this is calling for is for the church to be a place where people are not alone, where people who feel like their life is getting so hard that they want out actually can find, no, we can carry that burden. We can't carry it entirely. We can't make it go away, but we can at least be with you in that. And that is the vision of the church. That is the vision of Jesus, of Scripture, of the early church, which fueled its growth, and is, sadly for me, feels so much more flaccid in this day and age, especially in response to when life gets hard. So, AJ, tell, from the lens of your experience, what was that like for you? How did you experience the church when, and even now, when life gets hard because of the various particularities that somebody like Penny brings into your life?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing I'll say is I know that there are a lot of people who are experiencing disability or other forms of suffering and have felt really let down by the church. I am very grateful to say that has not been our experience. I was actually, because I was in seminary, I was interning at a church when Penny was born. So I was kind of already a little bit on the inside. And we were embraced. We had meals for months, and we had people who bumbled, to use your word from earlier, just in the sense of, I did have people praying that God would take away her evil Down syndrome. It was like, no, actually, that's not what we're praying. But thank you for praying for my family. So again, it wasn't perfect, but there was a sense in being surrounded and lifted up. But there also was a sense of our church being like, we're not quite sure how to do that, and I wasn't quite sure how to have them do it. And that, I think, is true in general. That my sense is that churches have an opportunity not only to welcome people and families with disabilities who often do feel very, very alone, but actually to demonstrate a different, way of being and a way of welcome that is a counterforce to what you were just describing in terms of the sense of despair. And even if we take it past, or maybe before, the deaths of despair, the epidemic of loneliness. So we've got lots of people who are not actually losing or taking their lives, although they are, in terms of their life expectancy being shortened by loneliness, right? Like, it is a health condition. And that's increasingly where our society is. And I do think that when you come into a space in which you see, someone comes to our church on a Sunday morning, what they're going to see is an 18-year-old with Down syndrome who sometimes is reading scripture from the pulpit, who often leaves her family in the middle of church to go sit with another family because of how welcome she is in that space, who is, at one time during Down Syndrome Awareness Month, she talked a prepared speech, but for 3 to 5 minutes, just to say, here's what it's like to be a person with Down syndrome. Like, she is really welcomed there. And it is clear from seeing her in those positions that if I come in and I bring my vulnerabilities, and if I bring the things that are not accepted in the world, well, gosh, maybe there's a place for me too.
AJ, speak to a listener out there who is a member of a church, and in that church, they know there's somebody that they maybe had passing acquaintance with, or don't even actually know, but just have observed, has a child with some sort of disability. What would be your top sort of guidance, pastoral guidance for that person, for like, okay, how do I welcome this person, this family, in a way that takes me into this realm of blessing that you're talking about?
Well, so I mean, it really is relationships. And the other words that come to mind are compassionate curiosity.
Hmm.
So I remember when I was, Penny was probably 3 years old. So let's say 15 years ago, I was at a party and there was another family there. This is not a church context, but it will relate. And there was a girl with a disability. And I was, in my mind, all I could think of was to say, "What's wrong with your child?" to the mom. And I knew that was not a good question to ask, because I knew I would not want someone asking me that, but I didn't have any language. Like
Yeah.
I didn't have another way. And all I needed to say was, "Hey, tell me about your daughter. I'd
Yeah.
love to know what's going well in your family right now. Tell me." I mean, literally just those words, "Tell me about your daughter," allows her to go in terms of like, "Oh,
Yeah.
it's been really hard lately," or,
Yeah.
"Oh, she loves macaroni and cheese." I mean, whatever it is. And so I do think having a few questions that are, again, compassionate but curious. The other thing I'll say within that is, I learned early on that there's a difference between a posture of pity and a posture of compassion. And compassion
Mm.
really is that sense of, I'm here beside you, not above you. Pity is still pretty like, I'm so glad I'm not you. Tell me
Yeah.
about your hard thing,
Right.
but like,
Yeah.
I want to be here with you is a different posture. So, and then the curiosity is, I don't presume to know. I don't presume to know whether your child needs support in a classroom or not. I don't presume to know what that would be. But I assume that they and you belong here, and that we have something to give as a church community, and we have something to receive, that there's some sort of mutuality that can
Mm.
happen here. And let's just have a posture of assuming that. But also, we can get so scared to talk about disability, as if it is this like stigma that, like, "Oh, I didn't mean to notice that your child has Down syndrome," and it's like, "Oh no, we're clear, we're clear on that." And sometimes, I mean, there are conditions where parents are in denial, and that's a different situation. But
Yeah.
for someone who is living with kind of an evident disability, I think that sense of like, "Hey, I want to know what your situation's like, and what would it look like for you to be involved here, and for us to support you," might
Yeah.
be the way. Because you don't want to be kind of saying to someone who's at the end of their rope, "Oh, it's time for you to volunteer at the potluck supper." But at the same time, you want to say, "We trust that you are going to be a contributor in some way."
Mm.
And that simply might be by being here on Sunday mornings or Wednesday nights or whenever it is. But it also might be simply by being a person who's in a posture of receiving care right now.
It's been a joy to have you. And please, I want us to both thank you, and please pass on our thanks to Penny for allowing you to share her story.
Well, thank you for having me. As I said, I'm a big fan, so it's really a delight.
Well, listeners, thank you for hearing AJ and Penny's story. Encourage you to reflect on that. And if you have thoughts about what this is triggering for you in terms of how you can be welcomed into a richer and truer picture of life, I would love to hear from you. And you can communicate to us by leaving a review for us wherever you get your podcast. We'd love to, I do read all of the reviews. I'd love to hear how this conversation that we're having here is rippling out in conversations internally and externally in our listener community. So thank you for listening. And next week, we will once again gather around the campfire.